One spell was enough to make an entire classroom question the way they understood modern magic. The greater danger was the name on the classroom door, because the real Seo Do-yun had died weeks earlier. I knew that better than anyone, because I was the man standing there under his name. Cha Ye-rin stood inside the practice circle while layered blue formulas turned around her raised hand. Her casting speed had already come close to Seongrim's record for that standard offensive spell. Most students expected me to praise her, because her control wasted almost no mana by the Academy's standards. I watched the finished structure for 3 seconds, then asked why she still used 6 unnecessary steps. Several students stopped writing as Ye-rin lowered her hand and stared at me with a furrowed brow. Those 6 steps appeared in every approved textbook used by Seongrim and nearly every major academy. Calling them unnecessary meant questioning a method generations of mages had accepted without serious challenge. Ye-rin answered with a precise academic objection and asked me to prove the claim in front of the class. I had no reason to bury the class in theory, so I raised one hand toward the practice circle. Forbidden Archive opened across my vision and separated Ye-rin's spell into individual formula layers. The archive showed 6 linked functions: drawing mana, compression, stabilization, shaping, release, and the final safety lock. I could see which stages protected unstable casters, and which remained only because generations kept copying them. I removed one unnecessary transition, rerouted the next, and combined 2 stabilization steps into a shorter flow. The students saw no calculations, only me tracing a smaller pattern through the air. Mana gathered with a low metallic hum, while the simplified structure locked into place above my palm. The same spell formed in a fraction of Ye-rin's casting time before the class understood what I had changed. A blue lance struck the practice barrier and spread a bright web of light across its reinforced surface. The barrier absorbed the impact, while every student in the room stared at the smaller formula above my hand. I told Ye-rin her technique was already excellent by modern standards, then pointed at the real source of wasted time. The delay came from the spell itself, where old safeguards remained long after better training made them unnecessary. Ye-rin studied the fading formula and stopped arguing, because the result had already answered her first objection. She wanted to know why no recognized researcher had removed those steps before a newly appointed professor did. I gave the safest answer available and blamed the habit of preserving methods simply because they were old. That explanation sounded ordinary enough for the class, although my real advantage was anything but ordinary. Forbidden Archive let me read a spell as a structure, break it apart, and rebuild only what mattered. I asked Ye-rin to reconstruct the simplified version without copying the movement of my hand. Her first attempt reached the 4th step before the spell core began shaking, forcing her to stop. I showed her where mana was piling up around the 2nd stabilization step and pushing the entire structure off balance. Removing one step changed the burden on every stage that remained, so simplification still demanded precise control. The class began writing again, because the miracle in front of them had become a method they could actually test. Ye-rin tried again, compressing mana more slowly and narrowing the final release, so the pressure remained manageable. This time the spell formed cleanly, although her casting speed remained far below my example. Her suspicion remained, but had sharpened into an interest that kept her watching me closely. That attention helped the professor I was pretending to be and threatened the man hiding beneath the name. I understood the balance immediately. Poor teaching would invite questions, while brilliance would attract even more attention. I continued the lesson by making the students identify which steps protected them and which merely consumed time. The room shifted from disbelief into debate, and the debate gave me a useful way to continue the lesson. By the end of class, several students were already testing shorter structures on harmless practice spells. Ye-rin remained the most careful, checking every change before letting mana pass into the next stage. I corrected her twice and deliberately left the final adjustment for her to discover alone. She found it, rebuilt the formula, and produced a cleaner spell than the one she had cast at the beginning. That small success changed the mood of the room more effectively than anything I could have said. The class changed its view of me, because my method had produced a result they could test for themselves. For me, that acceptance solved only the smallest problem waiting behind the name Seo Do-yun. When the lesson ended, students left in groups while debating which standard spells contained unnecessary steps. Cha Ye-rin stayed near the door long enough to study my hands before following the others into the corridor. I waited until the hallway emptied, then lowered the hand she had been watching so carefully. My fingers remained steady, but the muscles beneath my sleeve had stayed tense through the entire lesson. I had made it through another hour without giving anyone a reason to question who I really was. On the desk lay Seongrim's faculty seal, an access permit, and a contract bearing Seo Do-yun's name. None of those things belonged to me, Kang Tae-hwan, the man hiding behind Seo Do-yun's name inside the academy. I had never studied at Seongrim and had never passed any examination required for its professors. I knew Seo Do-yun's academic history from stolen documents, not from years spent living that man's life. One careless detail could expose the difference to a colleague who remembered the real professor's work. One unfamiliar habit could be even worse if someone who knew Seo Do-yun personally noticed it. That was why I never treated a successful lecture as proof that my disguise was secure. The better I performed, the more carefully I had to control what people learned about me. I gathered my notes and locked the forbidden archive analysis away before leaving the practice room. No student needed to know why their professor could dismantle an established spell after a single observation. No colleague needed to know how little I actually understood about Seo Do-yun's private life. Most importantly, nobody inside Seongrim could learn where the real owner of that name had died. The academy believed its newly appointed professor had survived the recent train attack and reported for duty. Only I knew the man named on those records had never reached Seongrim alive. Weeks earlier, I had been traveling toward the capital under an entirely different false identity. That borrowed name had already become dangerous, and I needed to leave the region before investigators closed in. I expected the trip to be simple: board the Manhwa train, reach the capital, then disappear into another district. I had no plan to become a professor and no reason to involve myself with Seongrim Academy. Seo Do-yun was only another passenger when I first noticed him several rows ahead. The man looked like a tired scholar, but several details refused to match that harmless appearance. His hands carried old combat calluses, and his balance shifted before the carriage moved beneath him. A reinforced suitcase rested beside his foot, surrounded by a mana suppression field too expensive for ordinary luggage. I kept reading my papers while watching the stranger through the dark reflection in the window. Do-yun never stared at the case, yet one foot always remained close enough to block its handle. He also tracked every stop, every ticket inspection, and every passenger who moved between carriages. Before either of us spoke, I understood that Seo Do-yun was hiding far more than academic documents. Then the train crossed another barrier pylon, and a single flicker of light changed the entire journey. The flicker lasted less than a second, yet both of us looked toward the same mana line above the carriage. Most passengers ignored it and continued reading, sleeping, or speaking beneath the crystal lamps. I kept my head lowered while Forbidden Archive traced the pulse hidden inside the interruption. One protective node in the carriage barrier had stopped answering the rest of the network. The failure was too clean for damaged machinery and too precise to be accidental. Someone had disabled a single defense point without triggering the train's central alarm. That required internal access, exact timing, and knowledge of how the backup circuits overlapped. No weapon had appeared yet. The attack had already begun inside the train system. Across the aisle, Seo Do-yun shifted one foot closer to the reinforced suitcase beside him. The movement was small, but it confirmed that he had recognized the same warning. A second pulse traveled through the floor, heavier than the first and impossible to mistake for rail vibration. Several passengers looked up as emergency runes flashed red along the carriage walls. The outer barrier folded inward at one narrow joint while the rest of the carriage remained intact. I watched that point tear open and understood exactly what the saboteur had prepared. The breach was large enough for attackers to enter while leaving most of the train intact. Glass burst from the side door as masked figures crossed the gap between two moving carriages. Their first spells struck the emergency controls and alarm conduits before anyone targeted the passengers. That choice told me the attackers had boarded for something more specific than robbery. One masked caster severed the alarm line, while another sealed both carriage doors with binding magic. Passengers surged from their seats as smoke-colored mana rolled from the damaged wall. I stayed seated long enough to study every active spell before joining the movement. Forbidden Archive opened fully and separated the attacker's magic into working formula components. The binding spell depended on 3 anchors connected by a hidden feedback line behind the main seal. The nearest shield used rotating mana layers that became strongest only in the direction of impact. Another caster prepared reinforcement around a short blade, building force through 3 compressed layers. The emergency lamps flashed red across the aisle, revealing every anchor whenever the shaking carriage shifted the attacker's footing. I shifted toward the aisle while the crowd pressed toward the sealed rear door. Seo Do-yun stayed beside his suitcase while the passengers fled toward the rear carriage. Seo Do-yun lowered his shoulders and shifted into the balanced stance I had noticed earlier. That stance erased the last doubt that the man had real combat training. The closest attacker moved to block the aisle and raised a shield across the escaping passengers. I watched the rotating shield layers pass through the brief angle where their protection weakened. I kicked an empty seat frame sideways, forcing the shield bearer to turn toward the sudden movement. That single adjustment exposed the rear anchor of the binding spell for less than a second. I slipped a short counter formula into the exposed link before the caster could seal it again. The binding spell shook as the damaged anchor pushed excess mana into the other 2. The remaining anchors took the excess load, pushing both past the point where the spell could stay stable. The sealed doors burst open as the attacker's own binding spell overloaded itself. The passengers rushed toward the rear carriage while the masked group tried to recover control. Seo Do-yun still did not move with them, and I understood the suitcase mattered more to him than escape. Another masked caster raised a hand and began compressing lightning for a shot down the crowded aisle. Blue arcs snapped across the ceiling rails, turning the narrow aisle into a live conductor beneath the gathering spell. I moved behind a seat support, forcing the caster to track me across passengers still squeezing through the rear doorway. The lightning caster fired before the spell had fully stabilized. I kicked the leg of an empty seat and sent its metal frame sliding across the aisle. The sliding frame struck the lightning caster's ankle as he fired, jerking the spell upward. Lightning tore through the ceiling panels and missed the passengers packed beneath them. The blast filled the carriage with white light and burning insulation. I moved through that glare before the attackers recovered their vision. I crossed the aisle through the glare and struck the lightning caster's wrist before a second spell could form. The caster crashed into a hanging luggage rack, knocking several cases down across the narrow passage. Those fallen cases delayed 2 masked attackers long enough for the last passengers nearby to clear the rear connector. A ruptured ceiling conduit spat blue mana into the aisle, forcing everyone away from the center line. The sudden gap left Seo Do-yun isolated beside the suppressed suitcase while the carriage around him emptied. His weight shifted forward when a blade dropped toward the case from the smoke. He rose beside the suppressed suitcase, caught a descending blade with reinforced mana, and twisted the attacker's wrist aside. That movement confirmed everything I had guessed from the calluses on Do-yun's hands. The supposed scholar fought with compact efficiency and wasted almost no motion. For several seconds, Do-yun and I moved through the same carriage without coordinating or blocking each other. Do-yun controlled bodies and angles while I dismantled the magic supporting them. An attacker raised a layered shield between us and the damaged carriage door. Forbidden Archive revealed the shield's repeating defensive rhythm before its second layer could rotate back into place. I struck the unprotected side with a compressed pulse and collapsed the shield inward. Do-yun crossed the opening immediately and forced the attacker away from the controls. Neither of us asked who the other really was. The train lurched hard enough to throw abandoned luggage across the floor. A second strike had hit somewhere beneath the forward carriages. Emergency runes shifted from warning red to the deeper crimson used for structural failure. The attackers had expected the train to survive their boarding, yet someone was now damaging it from outside. I saw one attacker glance toward the front with the sharp movement of someone receiving unexpected information. Whatever plan brought them aboard was starting to break apart. A damaged barrier conduit sprayed raw mana across the ceiling in bright blue arcs. One arc struck the suppression field around Seo Do-yun's suitcase and vanished into its reinforced shell. For the first time, Do-yun looked directly at the suitcase with urgency he could no longer hide. I stored that reaction away while another attacker charged from the aisle. The man's blade carried a reinforcement spell wrapped around the edge in 3 compressed layers. I stepped inside the swing, closing distance before the blade could build full force. Forbidden Archive showed the exact instant when those layers transferred force into the metal. I struck the attacker's wrist before that transfer completed and ruined the timing of the entire enchantment. The blade hit the floor with half its expected force. Do-yun used the opening and drove the attacker into the twisted frame of a broken seat. More impacts hammered the train, each one closer to the carriage center. The floor pitched beneath everyone as the mana rails lost synchronization. I grabbed an overhead support and watched the outer barrier tier open across another section. The attack team began withdrawing toward the breach they had used to enter. One masked caster threw a wide suppression spell behind them to slow pursuit. Its formula spread across the carriage in overlapping rings meant to drain movement reinforcement from anyone inside. I traced the suppression rings to a shared central pulse and disrupted the timing with one precise mana burst. The suppression field collapsed unevenly, trapping 2 attackers inside their own weakened zone. Do-yun moved before they could escape it. His next strike broke the formation and forced the surviving raiders toward the damaged side door. The train shook again, and the outside darkness flashed with sparks from severed rail enchantments. I saw the landscape tilting through the broken windows. The carriage had started leaving the stabilized track. Fighting the remaining attackers no longer mattered if the entire train overturned at full speed. Do-yun shouted for the remaining passengers to move toward the rear connection and brace against fixed supports. He abandoned pursuit, secured his suitcase strap, and moved toward the nearest structural brace. The last attackers escaped through the breach seconds before the carriage slammed sideways against the rail barrier. Metal screamed, crystal lamps shattered, and every loose object became a projectile. I reinforced my arms around the support just before the carriage rolled into darkness. When the motion stopped, the attack was over, but the consequences had only begun. When I opened my eyes, the carriage rested on its side beneath a field of broken barrier light. Cold air entered through shattered windows, carrying the smell of scorched metal and wet earth. The surviving passengers had already crawled toward the rear connection, while distant emergency runes pulsed along the wreck. I pushed myself upright and checked my limbs before looking for the passenger with the suppressed suitcase. Seo Do-yun lay beside a twisted seat frame, his coat torn and his breathing dangerously shallow. The suitcase had remained closed, but its suppression field flickered weakly after the impact. I crossed the tilted carriage and checked Do-yun without wasting time on questions neither of us could afford. The crash had injured him beyond anything I could repair with improvised reinforcement magic. Do-yun remained conscious long enough to keep one hand near the case even while strength left his fingers. That stubborn grip told me the contents mattered more than whatever story appeared on his travel papers. Outside, warning horns echoed between the rail pylons as rescue teams began approaching from distant sections. Those horns created a second problem for me, because official investigators would inspect every survivor's identity. My current papers could survive a routine check, but a serious investigation would tear them apart. The train attack had turned a quiet escape into the exact kind of investigation I needed to avoid. I looked back toward Do-yun and found his attention fixed on the approaching rescue lights. No explanation passed between us, and the wreck offered little time for one. Seo Do-yun died before the rescue teams reached our carriage. I checked once more, then moved his hand away from the case without ceremony. Death had ended every question I wanted to ask about the suitcase, the calluses, and the attack. A complete set of official documents now rested within arm's reach beside the dead man. I opened his travel case only far enough to identify what kind of man had been sitting near me. The official papers named Seo Do-yun as a fallen noble from a family that had lost most of its standing. No spouse appeared in the family registry, and no children were listed under his name. Both parents were already dead, leaving almost no immediate family who could expose an unfamiliar face. His correspondence showed limited recent contact with the capital and few meetings that required personal recognition. What caught my attention most was the sealed appointment letter hidden behind the academic papers. Seo Do-yun had been hired as a new professor at Seongrim Academy. The position had not begun yet, meaning the faculty knew his credentials better than they knew his face. I read the appointment twice while rescue lights moved closer across the wrecked rail line. With no close family and a new position far from home, Seo Do-yun had left behind an identity unusually easy to replace. I reduced the choice to one calculation: keep my failing identity, or take the name lying beside me. I needed Seo Do-yun's unused future more than I needed any bond with the dead man. I checked the remaining records for details that could destroy the plan immediately. The academic history was complete enough to memorize, while the personal records revealed almost nothing about his private life. There were signatures, seals, research subjects, travel permits, and formal references from people outside the capital. Nothing suggested a household waiting for Seo Do-yun at the station. Recent correspondence mentioned no close friend in the capital likely to meet him at the station. The opportunity was ugly, but someone living under false names rarely found an escape this clean. I made my choice before the first rescue night reached the damaged rear carriage. I changed coats inside the overturned compartment and transferred the appointment papers into my own case. Seo Do-yun's identification seal disappeared beneath my glove with the rest of the official documents. The suppressed suitcase came with me, because leaving it beside the body would raise questions I could not answer. I left its protected compartment closed inside the wreck. Whatever Seo Do-yun had hidden there could wait until the new identity survived its first inspection. I reviewed the dead professor's full name, birthplace, academic specialty, and appointment date while moving toward the exit. Every detail became another layer between my real identity and the investigation coming down the tracks. Before leaving the carriage, I looked back once at the man whose name would now keep me alive. I made no promise to honor the dead man's work. From that moment, one mistake could destroy both the identity I abandoned and the identity I had stolen. I joined the survivors using Seo Do-yun's papers before officials began separating passengers for questioning. The first inspection focused on injuries, passenger lists, and whether anyone had seen the attackers escape. I gave short answers that matched what every surviving witness already knew. I avoided unnecessary detail and let the professor's sealed appointment explain why I needed to reach the capital. The identification rune accepted Seo Do-yun's official seal without reacting to my face. That single green pulse ended the most dangerous part of the theft. From that point onward, the dead professor existed wherever I presented his documents. My previous travel identity could disappear inside the confusion surrounding the attack. I expected to leave the station, find temporary lodging, and study Seo Do-yun's life before deciding my next move. The appointment at Seongrim was useful only as proof that I belonged in the capital. I had no intention of walking into a fortified academy filled with experts capable of studying me closely. I planned to use the dead man's name, then disappear again once the investigation moved past the train. That plan survived the rescue line, the transport back to the capital, and the first document checkpoint. It even survived the station's secondary inspection without anyone questioning my face. For several minutes, I believed the stolen identity had worked exactly as intended. Beyond the arrival gate, an academy transport waited beside a man wearing Seongrim's security colors. The officer was already watching me, clearly there to receive a specific passenger. His attention moved directly to me before any station clerk announced the arriving passengers. A crest on his coat identified him as part of Seongrim Academy's security department. I checked the appointment letter in my pocket and understood the trap immediately. The academy had sent someone to collect Seo Do-yun personally. Leaving now would turn a routine arrival into a suspicious disappearance before the train investigation even began. Running would also tell Seongrim that the man carrying its faculty seal had something worth chasing. I adjusted the dead professor's coat and walked forward instead. The security officer introduced himself as Oh Tae-seok, head of the department assigned to receive the new professor. I returned the greeting with the restrained fatigue expected from someone who had survived a train attack. Oh Tae-seok took my luggage without touching the suppressed case and directed me toward the academy carriage. Refusing the academy escort now would look stranger than any hesitation I had shown at the station gate. The stolen identity had opened a door I never intended to enter. I kept that calculation behind a tired expression and let Oh Tae-seok lead the way. By the time the station disappeared behind us, Turning back had become far more dangerous than continuing forward. The academy carriage left the capital streets and climbed towards Seongrim along a private road guarded by barrier pylons. I used the ride to study Tae-seok without asking questions Seo Do-yun should already know the answers to. The security chief spoke sparingly, which made every ordinary remark more useful than a formal interrogation. He mentioned faculty housing, research access, and the schedule waiting for me after registration. I answered with short acknowledgments while building a picture of the place I had tried to avoid. Seongrim Academy appeared beyond the trees as a layered fortress wrapped around towers of white stone and dark metal. The outer wall carried several overlapping barriers, each forming its own defensive layer around the academy. Each layer pulsed at a different frequency, forcing intruders to overcome several defenses before they could reach the gate. Night patrols moved between elevated walkways while artifact lenses turned slowly above the main entrance. Mana towers rose behind the classrooms, feeding power into shields, laboratories, and training grounds across the campus. I stopped counting observation points once I understood the academy watched nearly every approach. The academy had too many experts, too many records, and too many places where a false professor could be examined. Entering such a place with stolen papers felt worse than crossing any normal checkpoint. The carriage passed the first barrier, and a pale scanning light swept across both passengers. Seo Do-yun's seal reacted automatically, matching the appointment data stored inside the academy registry. I kept my posture loose while the scan passed over my face without raising an alarm. The second barrier ignored identity and searched every passenger for abnormal mana contamination. The third examined restricted artifacts and paused briefly over the suppressed suitcase at my feet. Tae-seok looked toward the case, but my registered research clearance allowed it through without inspection. That detail told me Seo Do-yun had prepared access for whatever the suitcase contained. The carriage rolled deeper into campus, where students crossed stone bridges beneath suspended training rings. Some practiced spell control in open courtyards while others moved between lecture towers carrying stacks of sealed books. Every corner offered another witness who could remember my face if something went wrong. I discarded the idea of disappearing during the first hour. A sudden disappearance after arrival would place my stolen identity at the center of every security report tied to the train. Staying became the safer choice until I understood how closely Seongrim watched its staff. Tae-seok escorted me through a faculty entrance protected by a fourth identity check. This one compared the seal against the appointment contract and generated a temporary internal access mark. I received the mark on my wrist and studied its mana pattern while pretending to inspect the design. Forbidden Archive recognized several monitoring functions embedded inside the mark. The academy could track which secured doors I opened and which restricted areas I entered. That information mattered more than the convenience the mark provided. Inside the main administrative building, the corridors carried sound-dampening runes beneath polished stone floors. Portraits of former professors lined the walls beside plaques recording magical research and wartime service. I avoided lingering near any display connected to Seo Do-yun's academic specialty. I had memorized the paperwork, but paperwork could never reproduce years of professional relationships. Tae-seok led me toward faculty registration without offering a chance to separate. The process required signatures, mana verification, and confirmation of the original appointment documents. Every seal passed because I had taken the genuine papers from the dead professor. Every successful check tied me more tightly to Seo Do-yun's identity and made escape harder. A clerk handed me keys for a faculty residence and research room inside the academic district. Another document confirmed access to Seongrim's libraries under Seo Do-yun's research classification. Those privileges could become useful if I survived long enough to use them. For now, each privilege created another record proving I had arrived and begun working. The deeper I entered the system, the harder it would become to disappear cleanly. Tae-seok seemed satisfied with the registration and finally stepped away to handle security reports from the train attack. For the first time since entering Seongrim, I was completely alone. I carried the suppressed suitcase to the assigned residence without opening it in any monitored corridor. The house stood within the faculty quarter, close enough to lecture halls that leaving campus unnoticed would be difficult. A barrier panel near the entrance recognized my temporary access mark and unlocked the door. Inside waited basic furniture, sealed shelves, and a study already prepared for a professor who would never arrive. I closed every curtain before setting Seo Do-yun's suitcase on the desk. I inspected the room first, checking obvious artifact lenses and mana traces for signs of direct surveillance. The academy monitored access, but the private residence appeared designed to protect faculty research from casual intrusion. That gave me room to examine the life I had stolen. I unlocked the outer suitcase using Seo Do-yun's identification seal and found several layers of ordinary academic materials. Research notes covered mana theory, spell structure, and historical barrier design in handwriting matching the official records. Beneath them rested the items that had justified the suppression field. One was a dark key fragment marked with runes I could not match to any modern school of magic. Another was a small object wrapped in isolation cloth, its mana pattern hidden beneath multiple seals. I did not force either item open before understanding the protections around them. Forbidden Archive could analyze structure, but careless analysis still risked triggering unknown defenses. I photographed nothing, copied nothing, and returned each object to the exact position where I found it. The safest cover depended on keeping Seo Do-yun's belongings unchanged until their purpose became clear. A knock at the residence door interrupted my examination before I reached the remaining documents. I closed the suitcase and restored the suppression locks in the same sequence. Tae-seok had returned with a message from the academy administration. The headmaster wanted to meet me personally before my teaching schedule began. I had expected routine paperwork and enough privacy afterward to study Seo Do-yun's records. A face-to-face meeting with the headmaster erased that privacy and forced me to improvise immediately. I followed Tae-seok toward the central tower while reviewing every personal detail I had memorized from the papers. I ran through his birthplace, family decline, research focus, recent employment, and formal reason for accepting Seongrim's appointment. Anything beyond those records would have to be answered through observation and controlled ambiguity. The central tower stood behind another barrier layer guarded by senior knights. I passed through with the faculty mark and entered an office overlooking most of the academy grounds. Behind the desk waited Yu Seola, whose questions could destroy my stolen identity before I taught my first class. Yu Seola had access to the original application, faculty recommendations, and every security report created since the attack. She skipped every welcoming ceremony and began questioning me. I entered knowing a single personal question outside those records could expose the entire theft. She left the appointment folder open between us, several lines marked in fresh blue ink. Yu Seola asked about Seo Do-yun's research proposal before offering any welcome to Seongrim. I answered from memory, describing the same barrier inefficiencies listed in the application without adding unsupported details. She followed with a question about why a fallen noble would accept a teaching post far below his family's former status. The papers contained no emotional answer, so I built one from the facts already visible between us. I said ruined titles had little value inside laboratories, while research access could still produce something useful. Yu Seola watched me for several seconds before turning to another page. The response matched Seo Do-yun's circumstances without pretending to know feelings I could never verify. Her next questions moved between academic theory, travel history, and the timing of my appointment. I treated every question as a structure, separating verifiable facts from details that demanded improvisation. The headmaster changed subjects without warning, testing whether my answers stayed consistent across unrelated details. Facts received precise answers, while personal judgments received narrow replies that revealed almost nothing. When she referenced the train attack, I described only events other survivors could confirm. I never mentioned how closely I'd watched Seo Do-yun before the crash. I also avoided discussing the suppressed suitcase, because Yu Seola had not asked about it. Volunteering hidden information would create questions where none currently existed. The headmaster closed the security report and shifted toward spell research. This was safer ground because Forbidden Archive gave me real technical knowledge I did not need to fake. She challenged one claim from the original professor's proposal about redundant stabilization in older barrier formula structures. I studied the cited structure in my mind and found the weakness faster than the dead professor's notes explained it. I answered with enough depth to sound prepared without revealing the full power of Forbidden Archive. Yu Seola asked a second technical question, harder and less connected to the application. I traced the mana relationships mentally, removed an unnecessary assumption, and gave her a cleaner explanation. For the first time, the headmaster stopped looking at the paperwork before asking the next question. Her attention shifted from asking whether I matched Seo Do-yun to asking whether I deserved the research access under that name. That change lowered one danger and created another. Real ability could protect my false identity, but exceptional ability would make me memorable inside the academy. I kept my final answer conservative and allowed the discussion to end without showing everything I understood. Yu Seola accepted the contract and pressed Seongrim's seal into the appointment document. The faculty mark on my wrist changed from temporary silver to the permanent blue used by registered professors. I now possessed a teaching position, residence, research room, and legitimate access to academic archives. The cover had become stronger than any false identity I had used before. It had also become much harder to abandon without leaving records behind. Yu Seola assigned my first classes and informed me that the academy expected research activity alongside teaching duties. I accepted because refusing would look stranger than cooperating. I left the central tower with a folder thick enough to define the next several weeks of Seo Do-yun's life. My original plan remained simple despite the growing complications. I would stay until the train investigation cooled, keep my behavior within acceptable limits, then disappear under another name. The academy provided protection from outside investigators as long as nobody inside became suspicious first. That balance gave me time, which was all I had wanted from the stolen identity. Back at the faculty residence, I finally unpacked Seo Do-yun's documents in a controlled order. I separated academic papers from personal records and built a timeline of the dead professor's recent movements. Most entries were ordinary enough to support the cover. Several gaps remained around the weeks before the Seongrim appointment, with almost no explanation for how that time was spent. Those unexplained weeks also contained the only expense patterns connected to the hidden key fragment. It had no registration number, no research label, and no reference inside the academic files. That absence made the fragment more dangerous than any item clearly marked restricted. I wrapped it again and locked it inside the suppressed case. I then turned to the teaching materials Seongrim had provided for my first classes. The approved curriculum relied heavily on standardized casting sequences and repeated safety steps across nearly every spell family. Forbidden Archive exposed how many steps survived only because history had preserved them long past their usefulness. I saw immediately how the archive could help me teach without copying Seo Do-yun's unknown habits. I rebuilt the first lecture around 3 questions: how mana entered a spell, stayed stable, and reached its final release. That method would become spell optimization, though I had no reason to name it publicly yet. For the moment, I marked inefficient formula structures and prepared lectures that stayed close enough to the official curriculum. I needed believable competence without attracting revolutionary attention. The safest version of Professor Seo was someone students respected without forcing senior faculty to study me too closely. That goal lasted through the first days of classes and faculty introductions. I learned which corridors stayed crowded, which barriers recorded access, and which libraries required higher clearance. I also learned that most colleagues addressed me through my title and rarely showed personal familiarity. The lack of close relationships around Seo Do-yun continued protecting the theft. My research room offered another layer of privacy and access to Seongrim's historical spell records. There, I compared modern formula structures with older versions and confirmed that magical doctrine had accumulated unnecessary steps over generations. The discovery gave me real teaching material and made the role of Professor Seo easier to maintain. Each successful day reduced the immediate risk from the train investigation. I began calculating when I could leave without making my departure look suspicious. Then someone contacted me through a channel hidden inside Seo Do-yun's faculty residence. The signal did not use Seongrim's communication network. It appeared through a sealed mana pattern embedded behind the suppression lining of the dead professor's suitcase. I recognized neither the code nor the sender. Ignoring it risked exposing a difference in Seo Do-yun's behavior before I understood who was watching. Answering it risked walking directly into a secret relationship the dead man had never documented. I chose the option that provided information. I opened the communication link and waited, letting the caller reveal what Seo Do-yun was expected to know. A meeting location appeared through coded mana marks inside Seongrim itself. The message included no name, only a symbol I had seen carved beneath the key fragment's wrapping. Whatever Seo Do-yun had been doing before his death had followed his stolen identity into my hands. The meeting location sat far from my residence, hidden inside an older service corridor beneath the academic district. That night, I went to the meeting expecting another problem I would have to fake my way through. I carried no visible weapon, because arriving prepared for betrayal could itself look like betrayal. The stranger waiting in the old corridor bowed deeply and addressed me as Seventh Apostle Seo Do-yun. The stranger remained bowed long enough to reveal more about Seo Do-yun than any greeting could have done. Nobody lowered themselves that deeply before an ordinary professor, especially inside a hidden corridor beneath Seongrim. I answered with a small nod and let the other man decide when it was safe to rise. The subordinate kept his gaze lowered even after standing, careful not to meet my eyes directly. That fear gave me my first usable advantage. I knew none of the passwords, ranks, missions, or internal rules surrounding the Abyss Covenant. The man in front of me assumed Seo Do-yun already knew all of them. I turned that dangerous gap into cold impatience and waited without asking a single basic question. The subordinate interpreted my silence as pressure and began reporting before I could expose my ignorance. He spoke about members already placed inside Seongrim and warned that Academy security had tightened after recent disturbances. I listened without interrupting, storing every title and reference inside Forbidden Archive as contextual notes. The report confirmed that Abyss Covenant operatives had infiltrated the Academy long before Seo Do-yun's appointment. Their presence included access to service routes, research areas, and information moving through restricted departments. The subordinate never named every infiltrator, which told me the organization compartmentalized its people deliberately. That structure helped me, because ignorance could be mistaken for operational secrecy. I asked only what had changed since the last report. The question sounded natural for a superior and forced the subordinate to define the current situation himself. A project beneath Seongrim had stalled because access to a sealed area remained incomplete. The subordinate referred to that objective only as the seal, with no explanation for what lay beyond it. The subordinate expected the Seventh Apostle to understand every piece of context he had left unsaid. I kept my face still and asked why progress had slowed. The answer revealed that the Covenant had found traces of something older beneath the Academy foundations. Their methods could reach nearby passages, but the deeper barrier rejected every attempt to force entry. Seo Do-yun's role involved solving that problem from inside Seongrim while maintaining his professor cover. The appointment letter in the dead man's suitcase suddenly looked far less accidental. I had assumed the academic position offered Seo Do-yun legitimate research access. Now I understood that the Covenant also valued that access for an operation hidden beneath the school. The subordinate mentioned a key and stopped before describing it further. I remembered the dark fragment inside the suppressed suitcase, but gave no sign of recognition. Instead, I asked whether anyone else had handled the relevant materials since my arrival. The subordinate answered quickly that none would dare touch something reserved for the Seventh Apostle. Fear again supplied the information I lacked. The title placed Seo Do-yun high enough that subordinates expected commands, not explanations. That meant I could stay alive by forcing the subordinate to report first and reveal the missing context himself. I shifted the discussion toward security changes after the train attack. The subordinate had heard that Seongrim was reviewing faculty access and unusual mana disturbances around the campus. Nothing in the report connected the Covenant directly to the attack on the train. I kept those two dangers separate until evidence proved otherwise. I asked whether the operation beneath Seongrim had caused any surface incidents. The subordinate hesitated, and the delay became more useful than a direct confession. Recent experiments had produced unstable results involving captured creatures from below the Academy. The words were careful, stripped of detail, and clearly chosen to avoid assigning blame upward. I pressed with one question about containment. The subordinate insisted the specimens were contained, but he stiffened as he gave the answer. That reaction told me the situation was less stable than the report claimed. I did not demand names or locations because the real seventh apostle would likely know them already. Instead, I ordered the subordinate to report any change in containment before taking further action. The order sounded cautious enough to fit an operation facing tighter academy security. More importantly, the order would bring new information directly to me without forcing me to search blindly. The subordinate bowed again and accepted without hesitation. Before leaving, the subordinate asked whether I intended to inspect the seal personally. I answered that the timing depended on the academy's attention after the train incident. The vague response matched the security problem and avoided revealing whether I knew where the seal was. The subordinate read that answer as deliberate strategy and never suspected how little I actually knew. When the corridor finally emptied, I remained still until the man's footsteps disappeared beyond the service turn. Only after he left did I replay the entire report from beginning to end. The stolen identity had placed me between two organizations that could destroy me for completely different reasons. Seongrim believed I was Seo Do-yun, a new professor with legitimate academic credentials. Abyss Covenant believed the same man was its seventh apostle directing a hidden operation beneath the academy. Failing either role could expose the other before I understood what Seo Do-yun had been trying to accomplish. I returned to the faculty residence by a route that avoided retracing the hidden corridor. Inside, I opened the suppressed suitcase and placed the dark key fragment beneath a controlled mana lamp. Forbidden Archive examined its outer structure without forcing the deeper runes to activate. The fragment carried two distinct systems of inscription layered across the same material. One set of markings matched the symbol used for Covenant communications. The older layer beneath it followed a pattern I could not match to any modern magical language. That difference changed my understanding of the operation. Abyss Covenant had modified or marked the key, but the key itself appeared to come from something much older. The older runes proved the hidden system had existed long before the Covenant touched it. Every modern mark on the key pointed to the organization trying to force its way deeper into that ancient structure. I compared the fragment with Seo Do-yun's research notes on historical barriers. Several pages discussed sealed structures built before current gate classifications existed. The notes remained academic on the surface, yet certain diagrams aligned too closely with the fragment's hidden runes. Seo Do-yun had been studying old seals long before arriving at Seongrim. That work could belong to the professor, the seventh apostle, or both versions of the dead man. I still could not separate those two identities cleanly. I locked the fragment away and reviewed the Covenant report through the same method I used on hostile spells. Every known fact became one stable connection, while every assumption stayed isolated until something confirmed it. The organization already had operatives working inside Seongrim itself. It had captured creatures from somewhere beneath the academy. It wanted access to a seal that resisted its current methods. Seo Do-yun had been important enough to receive a high title and a specialized key fragment. Those facts formed a structure I could work with without inventing the missing pieces. I also understood why simply leaving Seongrim had become more dangerous. If I disappeared, the academy would investigate the faculty member tied to a recent train attack. If the seventh apostle vanished, the Covenant might search for the superior who abandoned an active operation. Both searches would begin with the same stolen name. I needed enough information to choose an exit that did not bring either side after me. Until then, I had to keep teaching by day and receiving reports from criminals by night. The absurd balance would have been easier if Seo Do-yun had been an ordinary lecturer. Instead, the dead man's academic work was becoming the strongest tool I possessed for maintaining the cover. Forbidden Archive turned the curriculum into structures I could genuinely analyze and improve on my own. Each improved lesson made the students trust me more. Each successful meeting made the Covenant trust its seventh apostle more. I was becoming convincing in both lives, and that made the consequences of failure much worse. Every useful answer from the Covenant created another question I could not safely ask aloud. Every successful lecture bought me cover while tightening my connection to the academy I planned to leave. I needed both sides comfortable enough to stop examining me closely. That fragile balance faced a harder test when Ye-rin returned with one question my first lesson had not answered. She placed my revised sequence beside 3 versions of the same spell cast at different mana outputs. Her concern was simple: a shorter formula might stay stable at normal power and fail when the load changed. Instead of demonstrating again, I asked the class to identify which stages carried more pressure as output increased. The students began with the low output version, where several safeguards barely carried any measurable load. At standard power, the same sequence distributed mana cleanly across the remaining channels. The high output version changed everything, because pressure rose sharply near the final compression stage. Ye-rin pointed to the exact transition I had removed during the earlier lesson. If that missing stage had absorbed excess pressure, removing it at higher output could create a dangerous failure. I accepted the objection and opened Forbidden Archive across all 3 versions at once. The structures separated into pressure paths, showing how each stage behaved under different mana loads. At low and standard output, the old safeguard repeated work already handled by the neighboring stages. At higher output, however, that same safeguard began carrying enough pressure to matter again. I restored the step only in the high output sequence and left the shorter versions unchanged. That correction surprised the class more than another flawless demonstration would have. I had no reason to defend my earlier simplification simply because it was mine. The method changed when the conditions changed, and the structure decided which version remained safe. Ye-rin tested the low output sequence first and completed it without the unnecessary safeguard. She increased the mana gradually, watching the pressure shift toward the final compression stage. At standard output, the shortened formula still held together without any visible instability. When she approached the upper training limit, I stopped her before the pressure crossed the safe threshold. I restored the conditional safeguard and asked her to repeat the same increase. This time the extra stage absorbed the rising pressure before it reached the final compression point. Ye-rin completed the stronger cast and watched the practice barrier take the impact without uneven recoil. The class now had proof that optimization did not always mean making every spell shorter. Sometimes the safer answer was knowing exactly when an old step became necessary again. I turned the result into a rule the students could use without relying on my judgment. They had to identify each stage's function, then test how that function changed under different conditions. A step that looked redundant at one output could become essential at another. Several students erased the shortcuts they had copied too quickly from the previous lesson. Others began marking conditional stages instead of labeling every extra step as wasted time. Ye-rin rewrote her notes from the beginning and separated permanent functions from load-dependent safeguards. Her questions became sharper because the method now gave her a way to challenge her own assumptions. I welcomed that change since careful disagreement made the class safer than blind imitation. I moved between desks and corrected students who tried to shorten sequences before mapping their pressure paths. By the end of the exercise, nobody treated fewer steps as the goal by itself. The real goal was a structure that stayed efficient without losing stability under the conditions being used. That distinction gave me a teaching method broader than one impressive spell demonstration. It also gave the students a reason to trust corrections they could verify through their own casting. Ye-rin still watched me closely, but now she was testing the method rather than searching for a simple mistake. That was more useful than unquestioning admiration and far easier for me to defend before senior faculty. The discussion moved from finding redundancies to deciding how each suspected shortcut should be tested safely. I refused to let anyone alter unfamiliar techniques without mapping the pressure and failure points first. Every proposed change had to include the function being removed and the condition under which it became unnecessary. Optimization became a method of comparison rather than a race to shorten every spell. That rule protected the students and kept the lesson from turning into reckless experimentation. I assigned them to document function and conditions before proposing any further change. The classroom shifted from memorizing approved sequences toward analyzing why those sequences had been built that way. I had created a teaching method without borrowing Seo Do-yun's personality. The faculty textbook stayed open on my desk, while its margins filled with structural corrections no dead professor had written. I no longer had to guess how Seo Do-yun would have explained every technical problem. Outside the classroom, however, the success of those lessons carried my name farther through Seongrim's halls. The stolen name only had to remain believable. My actual skill could handle the teaching. Ye-rin became the clearest test of that strategy. She questioned changes aggressively, which forced me to explain every optimization in terms other students could follow. Her failed attempts exposed where other students would lose control, giving me a safer order for each exercise. I never needed to humiliate her because successful reconstruction proved the point more effectively than embarrassment. The other students gradually accepted disagreement as part of learning and stopped treating every objection as defiance. That atmosphere made me more noticeable across the academy. Notes from my classes traveled between students faster than I expected. Simplified formula structures appeared in study groups and practice rooms even when I had not assigned them. The attention made my cover stronger inside the classroom and more dangerous outside it. Senior faculty could ignore an unremarkable new professor for weeks, which made restraint safer than showing everything I knew. They would eventually notice students discussing methods that questioned approved magical doctrine. I therefore kept every optimization tied to demonstrable structure and avoided claiming universal breakthroughs. I wanted evidence strong enough to defend the lessons if questioned. Forbidden Archive made that possible by comparing multiple spell versions across Seongrim's historical records. I spent research hours tracing how safety stages had been added after accidents, wars, and changes in training standards. Some additions remained essential to safe modern casting. Others had survived because nobody wanted responsibility for removing a rule established by an earlier generation. The pattern fascinated me despite the danger surrounding my position. Centuries of teaching had layered old rules over magic until tradition and genuine necessity became difficult to separate. Forbidden Archive stripped away that history and showed only what each structure currently needed to function. I turned those findings into careful lesson notes and avoided presenting them as sweeping breakthroughs. I tested each simplified sequence against stability thresholds before allowing students to attempt it. Ye-rin often reached the difficult transitions first because her control let her approach the limits safely. Her results gave the rest of the class a visible reference for what changed under the optimized method. One exercise compared two barrier spells built from nearly identical formula families. The standard versions used different stabilization orders because they had developed under separate schools of theory. Forbidden Archive showed that both could share a cleaner common sequence. I demonstrated the shared structure and let students rebuild the differences from there. The exercise taught them to recognize shared foundations across spell families, moving beyond isolated memorization. That shift increased casting efficiency without requiring more mana. It also revealed the true value of my ability beyond combat. Forbidden Archive could turn hostile spells into weaknesses during a fight. Inside a classroom, the same analysis could turn centuries of magical habit into usable knowledge. I understood why Seo Do-yun's research position gave the Covenant such useful access. Seongrim stored more magical theory than most private organizations could obtain openly. A professor could study seals, barriers, and historical structures without appearing suspicious. That access might have been the real reason Seo Do-yun accepted the appointment. I kept the possibility separate from fact, but it changed how I viewed my own research privileges. Every library entry could answer academic questions and hidden ones at the same time. I began comparing old barrier texts against the unknown runes on the key fragment. The matches remained incomplete, yet several structural principles repeated across both systems. The older runes treated seals as layered conditions that had to be satisfied in sequence. Opening such a structure required solving those conditions. Raw mana alone could not overpower its resistance. That idea aligned with the Covenant's failure to force the deeper barrier beneath Seongrim. I made no attempt to test the key until I knew where the sealed area actually lay. The Covenant subordinate still had not given me that location directly. A real seventh apostle would likely know it already, making the question too dangerous to ask. I needed the academy itself to reveal the path. Teaching gave me cover while research gave me clues, but neither solved that problem immediately. I kept my public method narrower than what Forbidden Archive could actually perform. I never showed students how quickly the archive could dissect an unfamiliar hostile spell under pressure. Classroom formula structures were studied openly, while the ability behind those studies remained hidden behind my reputation. That separation gave me a believable explanation for my knowledge without revealing the source of it. Ye-rin still watched more closely than the others whenever I altered an accepted casting sequence. Her attention no longer carried simple doubt, because repeated results had given her harder questions to pursue. I accepted that risk because a suspicious student was safer than an incompetent professor under formal review. Each successful lesson also gave me better control over the formula combinations I might need outside class. Teaching had become preparation, and that preparation mattered more as signs of the covenant operation began reaching Seongrim's surface. The first physical proof of that connection appeared before I could decide how deeply to investigate it. The training yard was already saturated with student mana, so the first abnormal pulse nearly blended into the exercise. I brought the class into a reinforced practice yard designed for controlled combat spells and summon targets. Students spread through marked positions while barrier artifacts activated around the training perimeter. The exercise forced students to maintain optimized casting while moving through the practice field. Ye-rin adjusted quickly, shortening her preparation without letting the new formula lose stability. Other students progressed more slowly, forcing me to correct pressure and timing one caster at a time. The session remained ordinary until the ground beneath one practice marker vibrated against the spell rhythm. I noticed the disturbance because it did not match any training artifact connected to the yard. A second vibration followed from below, stronger and closer to the center. The perimeter barriers showed no breach from outside Seongrim. Whatever produced the movement had already been beneath them. I ordered the students away from the central markers before the stone surface split. Black fragments of earth burst upward through a crack wide enough for something living to force its way through. The creature climbed into the training yard with mana channels glowing through its body in broken, unnatural lines. The damaged pathways looked repaired after injury, forcing the creature's flesh around channels that had never formed naturally. Students raised defensive spells while I focused on the dark thorn embedded along the creature's torso. The thorn pulsed with an artificial control pattern that did not match the creature's natural mana. Forbidden Archive recognized the structure before I recognized the danger behind it. The control thorn carried the same mana logic as an item hidden among Seo Do-yun's sealed belongings. The Covenant's underground operation had reached the surface of my classroom. The creature dragged itself fully into the practice yard before the cracked stone finished falling around its limbs. Fragments of training stone slid from its back and rattled across the practice circle as the creature straightened. Every movement pulled those channels taut, producing bursts of unstable light beneath its skin. The control thorn pulsed once, and the monster turned toward the largest concentration of student mana. I understood how the creature chose its target before it finished its first charge. Crude mana impulses from the thorn redirected the creature's aggression toward whichever target produced the strongest signal. That made the creature predictable enough to stop, but dangerous enough to injure students within seconds. I ordered the class behind the reinforced side barrier while moving toward the central crack. Ye-rin obeyed without arguing and helped keep the other students from crowding the same escape path. The monster accelerated when several defensive spells activated together behind the barrier. The combined defensive casting also brightened the barrier surface, creating one obvious beacon at the edge of the yard. I cast a short fire formula to the creature's left and created a brighter target away from the students. The monster twisted toward the decoy immediately, confirming how the thorn selected its direction. Forbidden Archive tracked the control pulses while mapping the creature's altered mana channels. The repaired pathways could move mana, but several junctions leaked whenever the monster changed direction sharply. I struck the leaking junctions, using the damaged repairs to bypass the creature's reinforced outer body. I fired a compressed pulse into the ground beside its front limb and forced a sudden turn. The creature chased the false mana source, overloading a repaired channel near its shoulder. A burst of dark light escaped beneath the skin, and the weakened limb briefly buckled. I repeated the angle from the opposite side before the control thorn adjusted its targeting rhythm. The second forced turn strained another damaged junction and slowed the monster further. It struck the practice stone with enough force to break several tiles, but never reached the student barrier. The thorn increased its pulse rate and pushed more mana through the creature's unstable network. That response made the monster faster while increasing the damage spreading through its own repaired channels. I saw the choice built into the control device and used it against the system. I stopped feeding obvious targets and reduced my visible mana output until the thorn searched for another source. The creature turned toward the barrier protecting the students. Before it could charge, I released 2 short spells from opposite sides of the yard. The competing signals forced the control pattern to switch targets twice in rapid succession. The reconstructed mana network could not redirect that quickly without forcing damaging pressure through its weakest junctions. Its body stumbled and several glowing channels went dark along the ribs. I closed the distance while the creature struggled to stabilize. I left the control thorn untouched because breaking an unknown control device could make the creature even harder to contain. My next target was the junction carrying mana from the creature's core into its reinforced front legs. A small, precise formula struck the junction Forbidden Archive had already marked as unstable. The damaged junction burst under the mana still flowing through it. The creature fell forward, carving deep lines through the practice floor with its hardened claws. It tried to rise by forcing mana through alternate pathways. Those pathways had also been reconstructed, and the added pressure spread instability across the entire network. I released one final compression pulse through the exposed junction near its shoulder. With its remaining pathways collapsing, the creature lost movement and stopped short of the students. Dust settled around the crack while the disabled creature lay short of the student barrier. I kept the class behind the barrier until the control thorn stopped pulsing completely. Only then did I approach the creature closely enough for Forbidden Archive to examine the device. The thorn had been driven into the creature and wired directly into several rebuilt mana pathways. Its outer runes carried Covenant-style control logic built over a more ordinary magical interface. I had seen the same construction principle inside the sealed object from Seo Do-yun's suitcase. The match connected the monster to the dead professor's hidden life more clearly than the subordinate's report had. Abyss Covenant had been experimenting with controlled creatures beneath Seongrim. One of those experiments had reached a training yard without crossing any external barrier. Dust still fell through the broken tiles, while the residual mana beneath them flowed downward through the foundation. The creature had clearly come from somewhere beneath Seongrim. I inspected the crack while Academy security signals began activating around the yard. Fresh mana residue clung to the broken stone and descended through a narrow channel beneath the practice foundation. The residue did not match any official transport or summoning system recorded in the yard's barrier network. Something below had provided a physical route into the campus. I concealed my interest before security personnel could arrive and turn back toward the students. I checked whether anyone had been injured and kept my explanation focused on the observable threat. The monster had appeared from below, reacted to mana concentration, and carried an artificial control device. Those facts were enough to justify an investigation without revealing why I recognized the thorn's structure. Ye-rin looked toward the disabled creature, then back at me after seeing how little force the redirection had required. She had now watched me use formula analysis under real pressure, where a mistake could injure students. The method looked different in combat, but the principle remained identical. I found the function keeping the enemy operational and destroyed it before attacking the stronger outer body. That consistency made my classroom claims harder to dismiss. It also meant Ye-rin had seen more of my actual ability than I preferred. I gave her no special explanation and redirected the class toward the evacuation route. Academy security arrived as barrier specialists sealed the crack and began examining the monster. Tae-seok entered the yard soon after, carrying a portable artifact for reading residual mana paths. I reported the creature's behavior while omitting every connection to Seo Do-yun's hidden belongings. The security chief focused on the impossible entry route more than the way I had fought the creature. No external barrier had registered a breach before the monster appeared. That fact placed the incident inside Seongrim's defensive perimeter from the beginning. Tae-seok ordered the underground route sealed until a formal survey could identify where it connected. I watched the sealing team cover the crack and memorize the residue pattern before it disappeared. Forbidden Archive preserved the mana signature more accurately than any sketch I could safely make. The signature matched faint traces I had noticed near older sections of the campus during previous walks. Those traces had been too weak to follow without a confirmed reference. Now I possessed a confirmed trail worth following. The control thorn was removed by Academy specialists and locked inside a containment case for analysis. I stayed back, since unusual interest would create questions about how much I already knew. The creature's path had left enough residue for me to continue the investigation alone. After the class was dismissed, I returned to my research room and reopened Seo Do-yun's sealed materials. The control device hidden there carried the same pulse spacing as the thorn from the monster. Its casing also held traces of the older rune system found on the dark key fragment. That overlap joined 3 separate clues inside a single structure. The Covenant, the underground creatures, and the ancient key were connected to the same buried location. I placed the key beside the sealed control device and watched both patterns bend toward the same preserved residue. The monster had revealed the route leading beneath the Academy's foundations. I waited until night before following the preserved mana residue away from the practice yard. The trail led past active lecture halls, then weakened near an older section of Seongrim rarely used by students. Stonework changed there, and modern barrier lines ended at walls built long before the Academy's current expansion. The residue continued toward an abandoned furnace district beneath a sealed maintenance level. I reached the old forge after the campus quieted and found that the location did not appear on my faculty map. Forbidden Archive detected a thin current of mana moving through the floor beneath layers of dead industrial runes. The creature had not created that current. It had followed something already flowing below Seongrim. A low vibration traveled through the key fragment, matching the buried current beneath the abandoned forge floor. For the first time, Seo Do-yun's hidden key reacted directly to a location inside Seongrim. I moved the fragment above the cracked floor, and its glow strengthened whenever my hand approached the soot-blackened wall. The key fragment warmed in my palm as I crossed the abandoned forge one careful step at a time. Dust covered the old furnaces, yet thin lines through the floor showed where mana had disturbed it recently. The residue from the training yard monster followed those lines toward a wall blackened by years of dead furnace smoke. Nothing on Seongrim's maintenance map marked a passage behind that wall. Forbidden Archive found modern runes first, hidden beneath soot along the lower stones. Their construction matched the Abyss Covenant's control devices and communication seals. Those runes formed a concealment layer covering the older barrier I had been searching for. Someone had concealed an entrance that already existed long before the Covenant reached this place. I held the key fragment near the wall without touching the modern inscriptions. The fragment ignored the Covenant layer and reacted to something farther inside the stone. A second rune system emerged through Forbidden Archive as mana from the key moved beneath the surface. Its lines were older, deeper, and built into blocks that predated the abandoned forge around them. The 2 systems occupied the same wall without belonging to the same period. I studied how the Covenant runes opened their concealment pattern around the original structure. I reproduced the outer sequence with minimal mana, avoiding any unnecessary signal that might travel through the network. The soot-dark wall trembled and separated along a vertical seam hidden between stone blocks. Behind it waited a narrow landing and stairs descending beneath the Academy. Cold air rose from below carrying mineral dust and the metallic taste of old mana. I checked the entrance for active alarms before stepping across the threshold. The modern Covenant layer recorded passage through several linked marks near the stair edge. I altered none of them, because a missing record could expose that someone had bypassed the system. Instead, I let Seo Do-yun's key fragment trigger the authorization pattern already prepared for the 7th apostle. The marks dimmed without raising any resistance against me. That reaction confirmed Seo Do-yun had been expected to use this route personally. I descended until the forge entrance became a thin rectangle of darkness above me. Modern stone reinforcement ended after several flights, replaced by older blocks fitted without visible mortar. The temperature dropped while mana pressure increased around the stairwell. Small Covenant markers appeared at intervals, each one newer than the walls supporting them. Some recorded direction, while others carried warnings about unstable passages and creature activity. Where the symbols remained unfamiliar, I read their function through structure and mana flow. The organization had explored enough of the underground area to leave navigation aids. It still treated the place like hostile territory. Farther down, the stairs reached a corridor where the older runes system covered entire sections of wall. Covenant markings sat above those runes in thin black paint and temporary mana seals. The contrast made the relationship impossible to mistake. The hidden organization had occupied the corridor, but it had not created the architecture. I traced one ancient pattern and found no matching classification inside Forbidden Archive's modern references. Mana moved directly through the stone, leaving no exposed lines for an ordinary spell analysis to follow. Everything around me belonged to a much larger ceiling system, far beyond an ordinary basement passage. Every wall could be carrying functions I could not see yet. I kept one hand near the key fragment and continued without touching unfamiliar surfaces. Fresh residue from the escaped monster appeared along the floor at several intersections. Its trail curved away from areas marked by covenant warnings and moved toward a deeper passage. I followed it because the creature had already proven where containment failed. The trail passed a broken cage frame abandoned beside one wall. I did not stop to inspect it beyond confirming the same control residue present on the training yard monster. Scrape marks beside the broken cage ran toward the deeper passage, matching the direction of the escaped creature's residue. Abyss Covenant had moved creatures through this underground route. One had escaped upward through weaknesses connected to the old forge and practice foundations. The corridor eventually opened into a circular junction surrounding a sealed stone door. Modern Covenant equipment had been placed around it, including mana conductors and several failed testing marks. Scorch patterns on the floor showed repeated attempts to force a response from the ancient seal. The door itself remained untouched beneath those marks. I examined the outer formula and saw why brute pressure had accomplished so little. The seal redirected incoming power through the surrounding stone, dispersing direct attacks before they reached its core. Its structure functioned as a sequence of conditions that had to be satisfied in the correct order. Pressure applied to the wrong section simply redistributed through the surrounding stone. That matched the theory I had developed from Seongrim's historical barrier texts. The Covenant had treated this ancient mechanism like a normal defensive barrier, which explained why their attempts kept failing. I brought the key fragment closer, and several ancient lines brightened across the door. The reaction stopped before completing the sequence. The key fragment activated only part of the sequence, leaving several conditions unresolved. Forbidden Archive separated the seal into conditional layers and highlighted several missing connections. Some conditions referenced mana signatures carried by the key. Others depended on patterns built into the door and corridor around it. I tested only the safest visible relationship, feeding mana through the key without forcing any locked layer. One ancient rune answered, and then another followed it. The mechanism around the door pulled mana toward its center, confirming that the key had triggered part of the unlocking sequence. A faint line appeared around the stone door. I stopped before activating anything I could not reverse. I still did not know whether opening the seal would alert the Covenant, the Academy, or both. More importantly, the escaped monster's residue continued past the circular junction through a smaller side passage. That route had already been opened by the organization and required no deeper seal to enter. Before moving on, I memorized the order of the runes that had responded to the key. I followed the side passage and found the modern Covenant markings becoming less frequent. Several sections carried damage left by moving creatures, with no signs of deliberate excavation. The mana current beneath the floor strengthened until Forbidden Archive began recording continuous environmental leakage. That leakage fed small traces of residue throughout the passage. The farther I walked, the less the space resembled a hidden laboratory beneath an academy. Natural stone replaced worked walls, but ancient reinforcement patterns remained buried through the rock. The system extended far beyond the corridors the Covenant had occupied. I understood that the underground complex was larger than the organization's current operation. The academy above had been built over something whose boundaries were still unknown. A low scraping sound came from the darkness ahead. I extinguished my hand light and tracked movement through mana fluctuations in the darkness. Several small signatures crossed the passage, then doubled back toward a leaking barrier seam. Their movements repeated around the same leaking mana, showing that feeding rather than patrol drove the pattern. The creatures were feeding on the leak itself. I advanced until the passage opened over a sunken chamber filled with broken ancient stone. Dozens of small shapes moved across the floor where blue mana seeped from cracks in the barrier foundation. Forbidden Archive marked their feeding pattern before they detected me. The hidden complex had finally stopped looking like a secret corridor. I had entered an ancient dungeon beneath Seongrim, with no gate signature and no official map. The walls carried no academy numbering or maintenance marks, only ancient reinforcement buried deep inside the stone. The mana leak alone had sustained a small ecosystem beneath the academy defenses. I could already see the advantage and the danger in studying a place nobody officially monitored. If the Covenant had reached only the outer corridors, much of this level might still remain unexplored. Forbidden Archive opened across my vision as the first Manhwa turned toward me from the chamber below. I fixed the chamber's position against the stair route in memory before descending toward the creatures below. I gave the hidden level 1 practical name, Floor 0. The first Manhwa raised its head when my presence disturbed the leaking mana along the chamber wall. Its narrow body was covered in dull plates shaped by years of feeding on unstable magical residue. Crystal teeth protruded from its jaws, catching the blue light spilling through cracks in the ancient barrier. Several creatures turned at once, drawn from the leaking stone toward my cleaner mana signature. Forbidden Archive identified no familiar monster record, only visible functions built into their bodies and feeding behavior. That limitation mattered because the archive could analyze what existed without giving me a complete answer. I needed to test the creatures before deciding which formula would work safely inside the chamber. I descended from the ledge and released a compact fire spell toward the nearest gnawer. The creature twisted aside, but heat scorched the thin membrane around one crystalline jaw hinge. Its plated back absorbed most of the flame without slowing the charge. Fire could damage exposed tissue, yet the carapace dispersed too much heat for efficient kills. 2 gnawers rushed from separate angles while a third stayed near the mana leak and continued feeding. I formed a narrow barrier between the charging pair and forced their paths into each other. The first creature struck the barrier and redirected along its surface toward the second. Their armored bodies collided hard enough to crack one outer plate. I stored that result in Forbidden Archive before the next gnawer could attack. Direct force reached the carapace poorly, but redirected momentum could make the creatures damage each other. I compressed the barrier inward at the next impact and trapped one gnawer's forelimb against the stone floor. The creature bit through the outer mana layer with its crystal teeth. That attack revealed why they gathered around barrier leaks. Their teeth interacted with structured mana and stripped energy from spell surfaces as they chewed. A normal defensive battle would feed them if I relied too heavily on barriers. I released the trapped limb before the creature consumed enough mana to weaken the structure completely. The gnawer lunged through the collapsing barrier and exposed its throat during the bite. I switched to a vibration formula and struck the exposed joint directly. The spell traveled through the crystal teeth and rattled the jaw structure from inside. Several teeth fractured at their roots, and the creature recoiled for the first time. Vibration affected the crystalline feeding organs far more efficiently than heat affected the armored back. Forbidden Archive recorded the response and highlighted similar crystal growths along the other gnawers' mouths. I adjusted the frequency and cast again as the next creature opened its jaws. The crystal teeth resonated sharply before splitting into bright fragments across the chamber floor. Without those feeding organs, the creature lost its ability to tear mana from defensive spells. I finished it with a compressed impact aimed beneath the damaged jaw. The remaining gnawers spread around the chamber, abandoning the direct rush that had already failed. Their behavior changed once several bodies stopped moving near the leak. I used that hesitation to study how they tracked mana across the chamber. The creatures tracked mana concentration more strongly than sight and followed whichever source produced the freshest output. I lowered my own visible mana signature and placed a weak fire formula beside the leaking barrier seam. 3 gnawers redirected immediately toward the false source. I set a compression trap beneath the approach and waited until their bodies crowded the same narrow section. The trap folded upward, forcing the creatures against the stone wall without maintaining a large edible barrier surface. Vibration passed through the compressed stone and into their crystal teeth simultaneously. The chamber filled with brittle cracks as feeding organs shattered across all 3 targets. I learned more from that exchange than a direct display of power would have taught me. Fire provided distraction and exposed softer tissue. Vibration broke the crystalline organs that made the creatures dangerous to spellcasters. Barrier compression shaped movement without giving them enough time to feed. The trap turned the chamber itself into part of my formula and reduced the mana I needed. Forbidden Archive organized the results into a growing combat model that still needed more testing. I continued through the chamber while testing smaller variations against isolated gnawers. One vibration setting cracked the teeth quickly, but the force spread through the skull and wasted too much mana. A tighter frequency formed more slowly, but focused the force almost entirely on the crystal teeth. I adjusted the balance until the spell could be cast fast enough for moving targets. Another gnower attacked from behind a broken stone column while I studied the change. I caught the movement through reflected mana before hearing the claws scrape the floor. A short barrier redirected the leap upward and ruined the creature's original attack angle. The creature passed above my shoulder, and I struck the exposed underside with compressed fire. The soft tissue burned quickly where the carapace did not protect it. I recorded the result without deciding that one element was always better than the others. Different openings demanded different formula structures and different timing. The archive provided structure, but combat still required timing, position, and decisions made before every variable was known. That truth kept me from trusting analysis more than experience. I varied the next exchanges deliberately, using each remaining gnawer to test a different formula interaction. By the end, the chamber held cracked crystal teeth, broken carapace plates, and small glands glowing with residual mana. I inspected the remains after confirming no movement persisted around the leak. The crystal teeth retained their ability to interact with structured mana even after removal. The glands stored unstable energy drawn from the barrier seam. Some carapace pieces contained conductive paths that spread magical heat across a wider surface. Each material contained a function that could matter beyond simple sale value. Forbidden Archive responded when I examined the teeth beside my vibration formula. Their resonance matched part of the frequency data I had recorded during the fight. That connection suggested dungeon resources could directly refine formula and become more valuable than ordinary loot. I tested the idea with one intact crystal tooth placed inside a controlled spell circle. I sent a weak vibration pulse through a crystal tooth and measured how the material changed it. The crystal amplified a narrow band while suppressing waste outside that range. The crystal tooth had solved part of the efficiency problem I had been compensating for through manual adjustments. I adjusted the formula to match that response, producing cleaner resonance while wasting less mana. The improvement remained small, but the implication reached far beyond one spell. Floor 0 contained materials shaped by constant exposure to ancient mana leakage. Those materials could become components for formula development if I understood their functions correctly. The dungeon had turned from a hidden threat into a progression route in the space of one chamber. I collected only intact pieces whose properties Forbidden Archive could verify. I avoided filling my bag with damaged material that offered no clear purpose. Crystal teeth went into one sealed pouch, mana glands into another, and conductive carapace into a wrapped stack. The careful sorting reflected the same rule I used in spell analysis. Every component needed a function before it deserved a place in the structure. The leaking barrier seam continued beyond the chamber through a passage chewed wider by repeated gnower movement. I followed because the strongest mana current traveled in that direction. The next corridor forced me to change tactics again. Gnowers attacked from narrow cracks where wide barriers could not form properly. I used small compression bursts against the walls, shaking loose stone to close approach roots without creating edible mana surfaces. When one creature forced through the debris, I triggered vibration directly through a crystal tooth fragment embedded in the trap. The crystal tooth carried the vibration into the target's jaw more efficiently than my earlier cast. That success confirmed dungeon materials could be integrated into practical combat formula structures. I saved the modified pattern as a separate version so the original remained available for comparison. Every optimized version still needed testing because a material that worked here could create weaknesses somewhere else. I progressed slowly through the corridor because nothing was pursuing me from behind. Floor 0 rewarded that patience with increasingly clear patterns. Mana gnawers clustered wherever the ancient barrier leaked. Their feeding widened small cracks, which released more mana and attracted more of the creatures. The ecosystem was gradually worsening the very damage that sustained it. I saw how the academy above could remain unaware while pressure accumulated beneath its foundations. The leaks were small individually, hidden under layers of old stone and modern construction. Together, they fed enough creatures to create an underground population directly beneath Seongrim. The Covenant had discovered the gnower population and harvested specimens while leaving the underlying mana leak untouched. The control experiments explained the monster that had escaped into the practical training yard. They did not explain why the organization wanted the deeper seal opened. I kept moving because every new chamber might answer that question without requiring me to ask a subordinate. A wider cavern appeared ahead where the floor dropped into several intersecting tunnels. Mana residue from the Covenant disappeared near the entrance, suggesting their regular routes did not extend much farther. Fresh claw marks covered the stone instead. Two sets were significantly larger than anything left by the mana gnawers. I crouched beside one groove and measured the spacing between impacts. The marks came from creatures with heavier bodies and a different hunting pattern. Forbidden Archive found traces of two overlapping mana signatures moving through the same tunnel system. They circled one another without fully separating, crossing paths at repeated intervals. The repeating pattern showed deliberate coordination between two hunters, not random movement through the tunnels. I reduced my mana output and entered the cavern with the modified vibration formula prepared. The smaller gnawers had already taught me enough to survive this level's basic threats. Whatever waited deeper would test whether those lessons could be combined under pressure. A tremor traveled beneath the stone before any creature appeared in sight. Then another answered from the opposite side of the cavern. I looked between the two tunnel mouths and understood the trap forming around me. The paired signatures never crossed directly, leaving one creature space to pressure prey while the other repositioned unseen. I recognized the tactic before seeing either body emerge from the tunnels. One hunter would force movement, and the second would punish the escape route. The cavern geometry gave that partnership several blind approaches beneath loose stone shelves. I marked those approaches inside Forbidden Archive and shifted toward ground that limited underground entry angles. The next fight would demand more than using one optimized formula against the right weakness. Floor 0 had finally confronted me with predators that could coordinate their hunt against me. The first twin burrower erupted from the left tunnel before the second signature showed itself above ground. Its body was broader than a mana gnawer's, built around heavy forelimbs plated for tearing through stone. The creature did not charge straight toward me after surfacing. It struck the cavern floor instead, sending fractured rock outward and forcing me away from stable footing. That movement created exactly the opening the hidden partner needed. The second burrower burst from beneath the path I had chosen to escape the flying debris. I caught the rising mana signature an instant before the stone broke. A compressed barrier redirected my movement sideways, but the second creature still clipped the edge of my coat. The attack passed close enough to show how tightly the pair coordinated their roles. Loose stone from the first strike was still falling when the second burrower vanished beneath the floor again. The cavern offered no clean recovery lane, because every forced step exposed another tunnel mouth around me. I could disrupt either creature alone, yet separating them inside the cavern would cost too much time. I needed a formula combination that changed both position and timing at once. The first burrower slammed the ground again, while its partner disappeared beneath loose stone. I placed a low compression field across the predicted escape lane and turned it into a hidden trap. The impact wave reached me, and I used its force to carry my body along a new route. My altered path carried me over the hidden compression field as the underground signature followed. The second burrower surfaced beneath the trap and struck a floor already loaded with redirected pressure. Stone compressed around its forelimbs before it could complete the ambush. I released a vibration formula through the trapped rock at the same instant. For the first time, both spells overlapped and worked together on the same target. Compression held the creature inside a narrow pressure zone, while vibration traveled repeatedly through the confined stone. Cracks spread across the burrower's front plates when vibration traveled back through the same stone it used for digging. Forbidden Archive marked the interaction as more efficient than using either formula structure alone. The first burrower abandoned its pressure pattern and charged to free its trapped partner. That change broke the pair's hunting rhythm. I expected the rescue attempt and placed a fire formula beside the trapped creature as a false mana target. The charging burrower adjusted toward the brighter signal and crossed a path lined with conductive carapace fragments. I triggered vibration through the fragments when the creature's forelimbs struck the prepared ground. The material carried the pulse along the stone and into both armored limbs at once. The burrower staggered, but its thicker armor survived the frequency that had shattered the gnawer's crystal teeth. I changed the frequency while keeping both formula structures active together. I compressed the ground beneath one forelimb while sending a lower vibration through the trapped stone. Compression restricted its movement while vibration focused on the section of armor placed under the most strain. The outer plate split along a natural seam near the joint. The creature pulled free before I could repeat the sequence. Its partner also broke from the first trap, though one damaged forelimb now dragged across the floor. The pair separated to opposite sides of the cavern and changed their pattern. Both burrowers disappeared underground together, abandoning the alternating pressure and ambush pattern. Two moving signatures crossed beneath me before splitting toward different angles. The tactic removed the visible attacker I had been using to predict the hidden one. I refused to chase either signature and changed the battlefield so both hunters had to react to me. I placed 3 small compression nodes through the central floor and linked them through one vibration trigger. The setup used little mana because each node covered only a narrow section. The burrowers closed from opposite sides beneath the stone. I waited until both signatures entered the linked area before releasing the combined formula. Compression tightened 3 sections of floor simultaneously. Vibration traveled through the connected rock between all 3 points, turning the center of the nest into a resonant trap. Both burrowers surfaced early as the pressure disrupted their tunnels. Their synchronized ambush broke before either creature reached the intended position. I attacked the damaged partner first because its dragging limb limited how quickly it could recover. A compressed pulse forced its cracked plate inward while vibration struck the weakened seam. The armor failed from inside the pressure point. The burrower collapsed, leaving the surviving partner without the coordinated pattern that made the pair dangerous. The remaining elite attacked directly after losing its partner. I gave it no stable line to follow. I alternated small barriers with short compression bursts, redirecting each heavy charge into broken terrain. The creature's own digging plates accumulated stress every time it struck stone at a changed angle. Forbidden Archive followed the growing stress until one joint was carrying far more force than the others. I used the linked formula again on that joint when the burrower committed to another charge. Compression locked the limb for a fraction of a second. Vibration entered through the strained plate before the creature could pull free. The joint failed, and the elite crashed across the cavern floor hard enough to crack the remaining surface plates. I ended the fight by striking the exposed mana line beneath the cracked armor. The chamber settled with both elite signatures gone from Forbidden Archive. When the second burrower's signature vanished, the 2 casting patterns in my vision did not collapse back into one. Forbidden Archive held compression and vibration on separate tracks, each retaining its own timing and mana load. The combat pattern unlocked a second parallel formula slot. A second lane remained visible beside my usual formula path, waiting for an independent structure. The change removed the interference that had forced me to alternate between spells during earlier fights. That advancement explained why the combined traps had become progressively smoother during the fight. I tested the new slot with a small barrier in one hand and vibration through a crystal fragment in the other. Both structures remained stable without competing for the same casting sequence. That breakthrough made the improvement permanent and turned combined casting into a repeatable technique. I collected useful fragments from the elites before following the tunnel behind their nest. The passage opened into a constructed room that contrasted sharply with the natural cavern around it. Metal cages lined one side, several bent outward by creatures that had struggled against confinement. Control thorns rested on a work surface beside damaged restraint equipment. Burned documents covered the floor, their surviving edges marked with Covenant symbols. The arrangement matched the hidden Covenant service corridor I had discovered above. This was one of Abyss Covenant's underground laboratories. The evidence confirmed the creatures came from Floor 0 and had only been modified inside the Seongrim facility. The Covenant had rebuilt parts of the monster's mana pathways and connected them to artificial control devices. The monster that reached the practice yard had been one specimen that escaped from this process. I examined the cages without disturbing anything that could reveal my visit later. Several restraints were designed around the same control pulse spacing recorded from the escaped creature. The laboratory had been testing how strongly those pulses could override natural behavior. Burned notes preserved fragments of diagrams, but not enough text to reveal the entire procedure. I recorded only the surviving fragments that were clear enough to verify and left the missing sections unanswered. The most useful evidence came from how the containment equipment had been arranged. Every cage faced away from a reinforced door at the far end of the laboratory. Heavy scratches marked the floor near that door, far larger than the tracks left by twin burrowers. The control equipment beside it used thicker conductors and multiple mana restraints connected to one central line. Something larger had been kept beyond the door. I approached and found the lock already damaged from inside. The key fragment remained inactive, proving this door belonged to the Covenant laboratory and not the ancient seal system. I opened it only enough to check the space beyond. A deeper chamber stretched through the darkness, and warm mineral air rolled across the laboratory floor. Then a slow breath rolled through that chamber with enough force to stir the burned papers behind me. Forbidden Archive caught a single mana signature far larger than anything else on Floor 0. The signature carried an artificial pulse embedded near its head. The Covenant had placed a control thorn into something the laboratory could barely contain. The artificial pulse arrived in uneven intervals, suggesting the control device was struggling against the creature beneath it. Each interruption released a heavier wave of natural mana through the chamber walls. I could already see that ordinary suppression would fail once the beast forced enough power through the thorn. I arranged crystal fragments near the doorway and stored a compression pattern inside the second formula slot. Only after both structures were ready did I open the damaged door completely. Warm air rolled harder through the doorway, carrying floor dust in slow pulses that matched the breathing beyond. The first elite fight had taught me to combine structures. The next creature would decide whether that progression was enough. The chamber beyond the laboratory door opened around a body large enough to make the restraint anchors look temporary. Iron Maw Basilisk lifted its head from the darkness as fractured crystal armor shifted across its back. Mineral plates overlapped from jaw to tail, each one carrying dense mana that scattered elemental pressure across the surface. A control thorn had been driven through the skull behind one armored ridge. Thick conductors from the Covenant restraints still hung broken around the creature, proving containment had already failed once. The basilisk turned toward me when both formula slots activated. Its first breath released a gray pulse that hardened free mana throughout the chamber into rigid patterns. The vibration formula around me slowed as its outer structure stiffened under the strange effect. Forbidden Archive mapped the change across the spell immediately. The basilisk could force active mana into rigid patterns, making spells difficult to adjust after casting. That ability punished complicated formula structures that depended on continuous correction. I cancelled the affected structure before it locked into an inefficient shape. The basilisk charged through the remains of its restraints without waiting for another spell. Its crystal armor struck the doorway hard enough to split the reinforced Covenant frame. I used a compact barrier to shove myself aside while the broken metal frame absorbed most of the impact. The monster recovered faster than its size suggested. Its tail swept through the laboratory entrance and destroyed the crystal fragments I had placed near one side. The basilisk destroyed the resonance path I had prepared before I could trigger it. I moved deeper into the chamber before the narrow doorway could become a trap behind me. Fire struck the basilisk's shoulder and dispersed across the mineral armor with almost no visible damage. The second formula sent vibration in from another angle, but the layered armor spread the force across its linked plates. The basilisk's armor resisted both elemental heat and the vibration attacks that had worked on earlier monsters. The basilisk opened its jaws and released another hardening pulse through the center of the room. I compressed my barrier into a smaller shape before the wave reached it. The smaller, denser barrier resisted the hardening pulse better because it exposed fewer mana paths to disrupt. I studied the mineral armor while retreating around broken restraint anchors. Each plate carried mana through microscopic crystalline paths that linked neighboring sections together. Those links allowed the armor to spread heat, pressure, and vibration away from one impact point. Destroying a single plate by force would require far more mana than I could waste. If I removed the thorn correctly, the artificial pulses driving the basilisk might stop. I used a barrier feint to draw the monster's head toward one side and moved toward the thorn from behind. Forbidden Archive mapped the control lines entering the skull through the device. I reached the base of the thorn and disrupted one outer connection with a precise counter formula. The damaged control network released a violent mana surge that shook the chamber walls. Natural mana surged through the broken connection and spilled uncontrollably into the basilisk's remaining pathways. Its armored body slammed against the chamber wall and shattered several restraint anchors in one movement. The artificial pulse became erratic while the creature's own channels flooded around it. I retreated before the next tail strike crushed the floor where I had been standing. Removing the thorn carelessly had made the boss more dangerous. Forbidden Archive showed why after analyzing the failed attempt. The control thorn forced obedience by restricting several of the basilisk's natural mana pathways. Breaking only one connection removed restraint without removing the stimulation driving the rest of the network. I abandoned direct extraction until I could shut the structure down completely. The basilisk charged again with more power than before. Its hardened mana pulse spread ahead of the body, stiffening every loose spell structure in its path. I used spell optimization to reduce my next barrier to the smallest structure that could survive one hit. The reduced formula formed faster and gave the hardening effect fewer transitions to lock. The basilisk struck, and the compact barrier angled the head just enough to miss my center line. I used the opening to place conductive carapace fragments against two cracked restraint anchors. Parallel formula maintained the defensive barrier, while a second structure linked those fragments through the chamber floor. The boss turned before the resonance was ready. I released early and watched the vibration spread into the mineral plates across one foreleg. The armor distributed the force again, but Forbidden Archive captured something different this time. Not every plate carried the vibration at the same speed. Each mineral layer resonated at a slightly different frequency depending on its crystal composition. I compared those intervals against the crystal teeth and elite fragments collected earlier. Materials collected across floor 0 gave me enough comparisons to identify the armor's natural frequency. Once I found that frequency, I no longer needed enough raw power to smash the armor apart. The links between the armor plates could carry the vibration deeper through the basilisk's own defense. The basilisk released another hardening pulse as I rebuilt vibration around the frequency I had identified. Spell optimization removed every transition unnecessary for holding that narrow band. Parallel formula sent a second vibration through the conductive carapace pieces I had placed across the floor. I waited until the basilisk crossed between the prepared anchors. The first formula struck the outer armor and entered the linked crystalline paths. The plates distributed the vibration exactly as they had against every previous attack. The second formula entered from below at a frequency designed to reinforce the first. Both vibrations met inside the armor, building pressure between the mineral layers from within. A thin crack appeared along one shoulder plate. A second crack spread across the chest as the connected plates carried both vibrations together. The basilisk twisted, accidentally carrying the vibration farther through the network connecting its armor plates. The same network that spread incoming force now carried destructive vibration across the basilisk armor. Cracks multiplied from inside the plates faster than the creature could redistribute pressure. Sharp cracks echoed through the chamber as crystal plates split along the mana lines running beneath them. I kept both formula structures active until the vibration reached the plates protecting the front legs and jaw. The basilisk lost support when fractured armor shifted against its own joints. It crashed onto the stone floor, breaking more plates under its weight. I stopped the resonance once the targeted armor had broken, preserving what mana I still had. The exposed pathways beneath the broken armor let Forbidden Archive trace the control thorn's network directly. This time, I shut down the entire control structure in one sequence and stopped every linked pulse. The mana lines around the basilisk's skull went dark one by one without producing another backlash. The basilisk's remaining mana surged briefly, then lost the forced rhythm that had driven its attacks. I targeted the exposed internal junction revealed beneath the cracked chest armor. A compression formula entered through the opening without fighting the mineral defense that had protected it before. My final strike collapsed the damaged mana pathway and brought the basilisk down. For several seconds, only falling crystal fragments moved inside the chamber. I checked the thorn, the armor, and the boss signature before closing both active formula slots. Everything I had gained on floor 0 had contributed to the victory. Spell optimization shortened structures so the basilisk could not harden them easily. Dungeon materials had revealed resonance properties that ordinary spell analysis could not provide. Parallel formula let me attack the same defense with 2 coordinated frequencies at once. Forbidden Archive connected those results, but trial and error had created the path between them. Behind the basilisk chamber, an ancient stone door opened after the boss's mana signature disappeared. The runes belonged entirely to the older system embedded through floor 0. Seo Do-yun's key fragment reacted before I raised it toward the door. The seal accepted the fragment, and the stone doorway opened onto a chamber covered with 7 linked positions. At the center rested a relic fragment carrying the same ancient mana as the buried structure. I approached without touching the remaining inactive positions around it. When I lifted the relic fragment, the key answered and projected a vast underground map across the chamber. 7 marked locations appeared across that map, each connected through routes extending far beyond floor 0. One position brightened in response to the relic now in my hand. The other 6 marked locations remained completely sealed for now. The meaning of Seo Do-yun's mission became clearer than anything the Covenant subordinate had reported. The 7th apostle had entered Seongrim to reach the 7 seals and open deeper layers of the forbidden dungeon one by one. I had activated the first seal without knowing what waited behind the remaining 6. The map expanded far beyond the Academy foundations, proving floor 0 was only the beginning of the buried complex. Then Seongrim's barrier network reacted to the mana disturbance created by the newly activated seal. High above, Yu Seola watched an impossible signal appear on a map that had remained unchanged for centuries. Someone had entered a region beneath Seongrim that the Academy believed completely sealed. I stood below with Seo Do-yun's key, the first relic fragment, and no clean way to hide my involvement. I had found the forbidden dungeon, and Seongrim had begun hunting whoever entered its sealed depths.